Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we are going to be taking a look at Orderly and Humane, the expulsion of the Germans after the Second World War by R.M. Douglas.
Oh, yeah.
So this book dives into a pretty heavy and kind of often overlooked chapter of history, the mass expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe after World War II.
Right.
And right away, the title kind of throws you off a bit.
It does.
Orderly and Humane.
Yeah.
Those two words don't really bring to mind images of, chaos and brutality, which we usually associate with, forced displacement and things like that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that tension between the title and what actually happened is something that Douglas, kind of plays with throughout the book.
Right.
He really dissects that historical paradox. And I think what we'll do today is kind of follow his lead.
Okay.
And we'll take a chronological journey through the events and maybe pull out some parallels to things that are happening in the world today. It's really eerie how relevant this book feels, even though it's talking about events that happened decades ago.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So to start off, I guess to set the stage, Douglas takes us all the way back to pre-war Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
Where tensions were already kind of brewing between Germans and Czechs.
Right.
And this wasn't just like a, little cultural difference. It was like a full-blown identity clash.
Exactly. And this is where the Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, kind of comes into play.
Okay.
They really seized on these tensions that were already there and started pushing for autonomy from Czechoslovakia and ultimately wanted to be fully annexed by Nazi Germany.
Right.
And Henlein was a master manipulator. I mean, he knew how to play on people's fears and anxieties, kind of like we see with certain political figures today who exploit those divisions for their own gain.
That's a scary comparison for sure.
Yeah.
And then you've got Edvard Beneš, who was the Czechoslovak president in exile during the war.
Right.
And he's already planning for the post-war period while, the world's still on fire.
Yeah.
And his solution to what he called the German problem was the expulsion of all Germans.
Wow.
It's kind of crazy to think about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of one of those devastating wars in history.
Right.
He's already thinking about redrawing national borders and uprooting entire populations.
Yeah, and it brings up, so many questions about the long-term consequences of taking these kind of drastic actions, both for the people being expelled and, the countries that have to receive them.
Right.
Like, we see similar challenges today with mass migrations and refugee crises. Integration isn't a simple process. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're solving one problem, but creating a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Which kind of brings us to the outbreak of World War II. And Douglas now shifts focus a little bit to the Volksdeutsche.
Okay.
Who were ethnic Germans that were living outside of Germany.
Right.
So they're kind of caught in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. And the Nazis were really good at propaganda.
Yeah.
They portrayed the Volksdeutsch as like these victims of oppression.
Right.
Who needed to be rescued.
Right.
Brought back into the fold of Greater Germany.
Yeah, classic us versus them narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was a very powerful narrative that fueled their expansionist ambitions and justified their aggression.
Yeah, and that manipulation of information and the creation of those us versus them narratives is something that we see, unfortunately, even today, especially with the rise of social media.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
To really drive home the point that war is anything but orderly and humane, Douglas throws us right into the thick of it.
Oh, boy.
With an event called Bromberg Bloody Sunday.
I've heard of this.
Yeah, this was in Poland. A retreating Polish military unit mistook some German civilians for enemy combatants and committed a massacre.
Wow.
Imagine the terror, the confusion, the complete breakdown of any sense of order or humanity.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to even fathom what that must have been like.
Yeah. It's a really powerful example.
It really underscores the point that in war, the lines between victim and perpetrator can get incredibly blurred.
Right.
And it raises questions about collective guilt and the dangers of making sweeping judgments based on ethnicity or nationality.
Right.
And it forces us to confront the really uncomfortable reality that atrocities can be committed by any side in a conflict.
Oh, sure.
And we see this same struggle today when we try to make sense of these really complex conflicts that are happening all over the world, trying to decipher who's really at fault and who deserves our sympathy.
It's really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how easily things can spiral out of control.
Yeah.
How quickly, fear and prejudice can turn into violence.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah. And that kind of leads us to a turning point in the book where Douglas starts to really dig into the expulsions themselves.
Okay.
And he makes a distinction between two types.
Okay.
The wild expulsions,
Right.
which were fueled by, chaos and vengeance, and then the more organized expulsions,
Okay.
which were overseen by, governments.
Yeah.
But even the ones that had a bit more structure things were far from orderly or humane.
Yeah. You're right. Douglas paints a really harrowing picture of the wild expulsions. I mean, people were driven from their homes with practically nothing,
Wow.
often subjected to violence and robbery along the way. Imagine being forced to flee everything,
Yeah.
with only the clothes on your back, not knowing where you're going or what's going to happen to you. It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom that level of desperation that people must have felt.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even during these, quote unquote, organized expulsions, conditions were still really, really brutal.
Oh, yeah.
Douglas talks about expellees being crammed into these overcrowded trains,
Right.
suffering from hunger disease exposure. I mean, it's such a stark contrast to the image that the book's title kind of evokes.
Yeah, the irony is almost painful.
Yeah.
And he uses a specific example, the row cut train, to really drive home this point. Many of the expellees on that train froze to death
Oh, wow.
because they didn't have adequate provisions and the temperatures were freezing.
It's crazy.
It really raises questions about the responsibility of governments. Even when they're trying to conduct these expulsions in a supposedly organized way,
Right.
how much suffering is considered acceptable
Yeah.
in the name of order?
It's a really unsettling question for
Yeah.
sure. And then, if the journey itself wasn't horrific enough, many expellees ended up in internment camps
Right.
in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other places. Yeah. Douglas doesn't shy away from describing the squalid conditions in these camps. Overcrowding, disease, malnutrition were rampant.
Yeah, he highlights one camp in particular in Smichov, Prague.
Okay.
The conditions there were absolutely appalling. Typhus outbreaks were common. Medical care was inadequate, and the death toll was really high. And what's particularly striking is that many victims of the Nazi regime, including Jews and political prisoners who had just been liberated from concentration camps, found themselves reincarcerated in these camps.
That's unbelievable.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's a really sad example of how that cycle of suffering continued even after the war was supposedly over.
Yeah, it makes you think about the psychological impact of this kind of displacement and loss.
Oh, absolutely.
Not only are these people forced to leave their homes, but they're stripped of their sense of belonging, their identity.
Right. They're caught in this liminal space.
Yeah.
Unwanted by both their former countries and the countries that they're being sent to.
Yeah, it's kind of like they don't belong anywhere.
Exactly.
The trauma must have been immense.
Yeah, and then you layer on top of that the challenge of resettling millions of expellees in a devastated post-war Germany. Imagine trying to rebuild your life amidst the ruins.
It's hard enough to rebuild your life.
Right.
But then to do it in a place that's been completely destroyed, with limited resources, facing hostility from people who see you as the enemy.
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And, it's easy to draw parallels to the challenges faced by refugees today, trying to integrate into new societies while dealing with the trauma of displacement and often encountering prejudice and discrimination.
It's a stark reminder that the consequences of war and forced displacement,
Yeah.
they ripple outwards for generations.
Absolutely. They don't just disappear overnight.
But amidst all this hardship, Douglas does offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
He talks about the Gablons glassmakers who, after being expelled to Bavaria, founded New Gablons.
Okay.
And actually managed to rebuild their industry.
Ah, that's
It's
amazing.
an inspiring story of resilience and community.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that not everyone has such a positive outcome.
Right. It's a testament to the human spirit, our ability to adapt and rebuild, even in the face of unimaginable adversity.
Right.
But it also highlights the importance of support systems and opportunities for integration.
Right.
The Gablons glassmakers were fortunate to have a specific skill set that was in demand. But many others struggled to find their footing in a society that was still reeling from the war.
So how did the international community respond to all of this?
Well, the reaction was mixed, to say the least.
Okay.
Some voices did speak out against the brutality of the expulsions, recognizing the inherent injustice of uprooting millions of people based solely on their ethnicity.
Right.
However, others, especially those who had suffered under Nazi occupation, had very little sympathy for the expellees.
Okay.
The wounds of war were still fresh.
Yeah.
And for many, the expulsions felt like a form of retribution, a way to make the Germans pay for what they had done.
Yeah, it's understandable.
And this complexity of emotions, the struggle to balance justice with empathy
Right.
is something that we still grapple with even today when we're confronting past wrongs and trying to heal divisions.
It's a reminder that forgiveness and reconciliation are long and difficult processes,
Yeah, they take time.
especially when dealing with the legacy of such immense suffering.
Mhm.
And this ties back to a key theme in the book, the moral and legal ambiguity surrounding forced population transfers.
Right.
Was this a justifiable response to the horrors of the Nazi regime, or was it a violation of fundamental human rights?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. Douglas doesn't really offer any easy answers.
Mhm.
He presents the various perspectives and kind of highlights the challenges of applying international law to these really complex situations.
Not a black and white issue.
Yeah, and one particularly poignant example he uses is the case of Johannes Koska.
Okay.
Koska's wife had been raped and threatened suicide after being left behind in Poland during the expulsions.
Oh, wow.
He appealed to the U.S. authorities to expedite her expulsion, hoping to save her from further suffering.
Right.
But he was met with bureaucratic indifference.
Oh, my God.
It's a chilling illustration of how individuals can get lost in the machinery of these large-scale operations.
Right.
How policies that may seem justified on paper
Yeah.
can have devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
For real people.
It's a story that really sticks with you.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history is more than just dates and events.
Right.
It's about the lived experiences
Right.
of individuals caught up in forces beyond their control.
Yeah. And sometimes those individual stories reveal the true cost of these grand political schemes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the responsibility we have to remember these stories, to learn from the past, and to try to do better in the present.
Yeah.
And speaking of remembering the past, that leads us to the final part of the book where Douglas explores the lasting legacy of these expulsions and the ongoing struggle for reconciliation. It's amazing how an event that happened decades ago can still have such a powerful impact on relations between countries today.
Absolutely. Douglas brings up the controversy surrounding the Center Against Expulsions in Berlin, which aimed to commemorate the suffering of the expellees. The very idea of this center sparked intense debate, accusations of historical revisionism, attempts to downplay German culpability for the war and the Holocaust. It became a lightning rod for all of these unresolved grievances and competing narratives about the past.
It's a stark reminder that history is often contested with different groups, vying for control of the narrative. And that kind of brings us back to the book's title, Orderly and Humane. It seems almost absurd in light of everything we've learned.
It is. It's a deliberate provocation, I think, forcing us to confront the gap between rhetoric and reality.
Right.
The expulsions were anything but orderly or humane,
Yeah.
and yet that language was used to justify them, to make them more palatable to the international community.
Right.
It highlights the danger of euphemisms and the way language can be used to mask uncomfortable truths.
For sure.
I mean, we see this all the time in contemporary politics,
Oh, yeah.
where words are carefully chosen to spin events and manipulate public perception.
It's a reminder to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives that we're presented with, and to dig deeper to uncover the complexities beneath the surface. So having gone through this deep dive into Orderly and Humane, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think this book serves as a powerful testament to the human cost of war and displacement. It reminds us that even decades later, the consequences of these events continue to reverberate. It challenges us to think critically about simplistic solutions to complex problems, especially those rooted in ethnic or national divisions. And it reminds us that true reconciliation requires acknowledging the suffering of all parties involved, even those we may perceive as the enemy.
It's a call for empathy, understanding, and a nuanced perspective on history. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the pre-war tensions that set the stage for the expulsions to the chaotic and brutal realities of forced displacement and the ongoing struggle for healing and reconciliation. It's a heavy topic, but an incredibly important one to grapple with.
The expulsion of Germans after World War II was a tragedy on a massive scale, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the enduring consequences of hatred and violence. But it also offers a glimmer of hope. The fact that we're still talking about these events, that we're trying to understand them and learn from them, shows that we haven't given up on the quest for a more just and humane world.
And that's a good note to end on. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, I highly recommend checking out R.M. Douglas's Orderly and Humane. It's a challenging read, but one that will stay with you long after you finish the last page. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.